The divorce papers landed on my hospital bed while my surgical wound was still bleeding through the bandages. 3 days after giving his mother my kidney, my husband David stood there with his lawyer, watching me struggle to sit up against the pillows. The morphine made everything fuzzy, but his words cut through the haze like a blade. "I need someone whole, Olivia. Someone who can give me children without complications." You'd think this was just another tale of medical betrayal. But what happened next proved that sometimes the universe has its own sense of justice. For 2 years, I'd watched Margaret, my mother-in-law, waste away from kidney disease while David begged me to get tested. "You're the only match in the family," he'd said, holding my hands. "Please, Olivia, save her. Save us." I believed him when he promised we'd grow old together. When he whispered that this sacrifice would make us stronger. The surgery had been brutal. 8 hours under the knife, weeks of recovery ahead, and a lifetime of medical monitoring. Margaret had hugged me afterward, tears streaming down her face as she promised to treat me like her own daughter forever. David had kissed my forehead and called me his hero. 3 days later, he was explaining why our marriage was over while I couldn't even walk to the bathroom alone. My name is Olivia Miller, and this is the story of when I learned that kindness to cruel people is just delayed justice. But before we continue, please like and subscribe to the channel, especially the like. You can't imagine how much it helps me keep going every day. His reasoning was clinical, delivered with the same tone he used for business presentations. The surgery meant complications for future pregnancies. My reduced kidney function would affect our insurance premiums. I'd need regular medical care that would drain our resources. He'd already consulted lawyers, already moved his belongings out of our house. The papers were pre-signed, just waiting for my signature. Margaret stood behind him the entire time, her face blank, saying nothing. 3 days earlier, she'd been dying. Now, she watched her son destroy the woman who'd saved her life without uttering a word of protest. When I asked if she had anything to say, she simply turned her back and walked out of the room. The machine monitoring my vital signs began beeping faster. I signed those papers with a hand that shook from surgical trauma and heartbreak. David collected them with satisfaction, straightening his tie as if he'd just closed a successful business deal. "The house is mine," he said matter-of-factly. "You can stay until you're recovered enough to find somewhere else." Then he paused at the door, almost as an afterthought. "Oh, and Olivia, don't expect any help with the medical bills. Those are your responsibility now." The nurse who witnessed my signature looked appalled. She'd seen my charts, knew what I'd been through, understood the magnitude of my sacrifice. After David left, she squeezed my shoulder and whispered, "Honey, sometimes the trash takes itself out." I managed a weak smile, but inside something harder than grief was taking root. Something cold and patient. 2 weeks later, I returned to what I'd thought was our home to find my belongings in garbage bags on the front porch. My key no longer worked. Through the living room window, I could see Margaret sitting at my kitchen table, laughing with a young brunette I'd never seen before. David emerged from the kitchen carrying champagne glasses, his arm wrapped around the stranger's waist like they'd been together for years. The brunette was everything I wasn't at that moment, healthy, glowing, probably 10 years younger than my 34 years. She wore one of my dresses, the blue one David had bought me for our anniversary. Margaret was showing her photo albums, the same ones she'd shared with me when I was the beloved daughter-in-law. The scene looked like a bizarre family reunion where I'd been erased completely. I stood there for nearly an hour watching them celebrate while my surgical site throbbed and my legs trembled from exhaustion. Neighbors began to gather, pretending to water their gardens or check their mailboxes while stealing glances at the spectacle. Mrs. Henderson from next door finally approached, her face pinched with disapproval. "Olivia, dear, what's happening here?" she asked, though her tone suggested she already knew. Before I could answer, David appeared at the front door. He wasn't embarrassed or apologetic. If anything, he seemed annoyed by my presence, like I was an unwelcome solicitor interrupting his celebration. "You need to collect your things and go," he said loudly enough for the gathering neighbors to hear. "The house belongs to me, and you're trespassing." Margaret appeared beside him, nodding in agreement as if I was some stranger causing trouble. The brunette joined them, her hand possessively on David's chest. "Is this the ex-wife?" she asked, looking me up and down with obvious distaste. God, David, you didn't tell me she looked so sick? Margaret laughed. Actually laughed at this assessment of the woman who'd literally given her life back to her. The sound was sharp and cruel, nothing like the grateful mother-in-law who'd wept at my bedside. I bent to pick up the garbage bags, my incisions screaming in protest. Every movement was agony, but I refused to show weakness in front of them. As I struggled with the weight, none of them offered to help. Instead, they watched like it was entertainment, whispering among themselves and occasionally chuckling. The brunette even took a photo with her phone, probably for social media. Mrs. Henderson stepped forward to help me carry the bags to my car, her face flushed with outrage. "This is disgraceful," she muttered. "After what you did for that woman," but as we loaded my possessions into my trunk, I noticed other neighbors retreating into their houses, suddenly busy with indoor tasks. The spectacle was too uncomfortable, too raw for polite suburban consumption. As I drove away, I saw them through the rearview mirror, returning to their celebration. Margaret raised her champagne glass in a mock toast toward my departing car. The brunette was already rearranging the living room furniture, making herself at home in the space I'd shared with David for 5 years. But something strange happened as I watched that scene recede. Instead of crying, I found myself smiling. A cold, calculating smile that surprised even me. Within a week, Margaret had transformed me from family hero to neighborhood pariah through a systematic character assassination campaign. She told anyone who'd listened that I'd demanded payment for the kidney donation, that I'd become unstable and violent after the surgery, that I'd threatened to harm her if David didn't stay married to me. The lies were elaborate and convincing, delivered with the trembling voice of a grateful transplant patient who'd been victimized by her unhinged donor. My own friends began avoiding my calls. Jessica, who'd been my maid of honor, sent a brief text. "Maybe you need professional help, Olivia." Margaret told us what really happened. When I tried to explain, she blocked my number. My book club, my yoga class, even the grocery store clerks who'd known me for years. They all started treating me like I carried some contagious form of crazy. The worst part was how believable Margaret made it sound. She had proof of my instability. Photos of me looking haggarded and exhausted during recovery, taken without my knowledge. She shared medical documents that showed my emotional state during hospitalization, twisting normal post-surgical depression into evidence of dangerous mental illness. She even produced witnesses, the brunette, who claimed I'd threatened her during a stalking incident at the house. David played his part perfectly. The long-suffering husband who'd finally escaped an abusive marriage. At the coffee shop where I'd been a regular for 3 years, I overheard him telling the barista how I'd become obsessed with control after the surgery, how I'd used the kidney donation to manipulate him emotionally. "She thinks I owe her my entire life because of one medical procedure," he said, shaking his head sadly. The isolation was suffocating. My employer, a small marketing firm, began giving me fewer projects after Margaret called, claiming I'd harassed her at home. My landlord at the tiny apartment I'd managed to rent received complaints about disturbing behavior from my supposed former in-laws. Even my own brother started screening my calls after Margaret reached out to warn him about my deteriorating mental state. But Margaret made one crucial mistake in her campaign of destruction. She got too comfortable, too confident in her lies. At the grocery store, I watched her perform for a group of neighborhood women, dramatically describing how I demanded she pay me $50,000 for the kidney. She clutched her chest, voice breaking as she explained how terrified she was of her unstable former daughter-in-law, who might try to reclaim the donated organ. The women listened with horrified fascination, murmuring sympathetic responses and shooting me disgusted looks when they noticed me nearby. Margaret seemed to feed off their attention, embellishing the story with each telling. She described fictional threats, imaginary confrontations, elaborate schemes I'd supposedly planned. The lies grew bigger and more dramatic every time she told them. As I stood there listening to her performance, something crystallized in my mind. Margaret wasn't just destroying my reputation. She was creating a narrative so extreme, so obviously fabricated that eventually it would collapse under its own weight. All I had to do was wait, stay quiet, and let her dig her own grave with increasingly ridiculous accusations. The truth has a way of surfacing, and liars eventually forget which version of their story they told to whom. 3 months. After the surgery, my body began failing in ways the doctors hadn't anticipated. The remaining kidney was struggling to handle the full workload. My blood pressure spiked dangerously, and chronic fatigue made even simple tasks feel impossible. I'd lost 20 libby I couldn't afford to lose, and my skin had taken on a grayish pallor that made strangers uncomfortable. The medical bills were crushing me slowly, $50 at a time. My tiny studio apartment felt like a prison cell. The walls were thin enough that I could hear my neighbors discussing my situation. Apparently, Margaret had contacted them too, warning about the unstable kidney donor living nearby. Mrs. Chen from the apartment management company called to inform me that several residents had complained about feeling unsafe due to my presence. Though I rarely left my apartment except for medical appointments, the insurance battle was a nightmare that consumed entire days. Since David had removed me from his policy immediately after the divorce, I was fighting to get coverage for post-surgical care related to the donation. Representatives spoke to me like I was trying to defraud the system, questioning why I'd need ongoing monitoring if I'd voluntarily given up an organ. The irony wasn't lost on me. He was being punished for an act of generosity. One evening, I collapsed in the bathroom, vomiting blood until I was too weak to stand. My phone was in the living room, unreachable as I lay on the cold tile floor, wondering if this washoe it would end. When I finally managed to crawl to the phone and call an ambulance, the paramedics found me barely conscious. My blood pressure at stroke levels. At the hospital, a young resident looked at my charts with confusion. "Ma'am, didn't anyone tell you that kidney donors need lifelong monitoring?" During that hospitalization, I made the mistake of calling Margaret. I was desperate, terrified, hoping that seeing her former daughter-in-law fighting for life might trigger some latent humanity. She answered on the first ring, her voice bright and cheerful until she realized who was calling. "Olivia, why are you bothering me?" The coldness in her tone was absolute, like I was a telemarketer interrupting her evening. I explained my situation weakly. The medical crisis, the insurance problems, the possibility that complications from the donation might kill me. There was a long pause before she responded with words that cut deeper than any surgical incision. "Well, you got what you wanted, didn't you? Attention and sympathy. Don't expect me to feel guilty about living." Then she hung up, leaving me staring at the phone in the sterile hospital room. The financial stress was destroying what remained of my stability. I'd burned through my savings, paying for medical care that should have been covered under post-donation protocols. My part-time work barely covered rent, let alone food and medications. I found myself choosing between prescriptions and electricity bills, between doctor visits and groceries. Pride kept me from asking my family for help. Margaret's poison had reached them too. But as I lay in that hospital bed, something shifted inside me. Maybe it was the medication. Maybe it was hitting absolute bottom. But I started to see the situation clearly for the first time. Margaret hadn't just stolen my kidney. She'd stolen my marriage, my reputation, my health, and my peace of mind. She was living her best life while I was dying alone. The injustice of it all should have filled me with rage. But instead, I felt something colder settling in my chest. Patience. The kind of patience that waits for the universe to balance its scales. While I struggled to survive in my studio apartment, Margaret began her transformation into a local celebrity. The kidney transplant had given her more than just renewed health. It had provided her with a compelling narrative for social media and community engagement. Her Instagram account, which had been dormant for years, suddenly exploded with inspirational posts about second chances and the gift of life, carefully omitting any mention of the actual donor. She joined every charity organization in town, speaking at events about organ donation and medical miracles. The local newspaper ran a feature story about her brave battle and miraculous recovery, complete with professional photos of her looking vibrant and healthy. She'd reinvented herself as a survivor and advocate, basking in admiration while painting me as the villain who'd tried to exploit their vulnerability. David's life had improved dramatically, too. The brunette, whose name was Amanda, came from a wealthy family with connections in the construction industry. Within months of their relationship becoming public, David's struggling contracting business was suddenly landing major contracts. He traded in his old sedan for a luxury SUV, moved to a bigger house in the expensive part of town, and began posting photos of exotic vacations on social media. The contrast between their prosperity and my poverty was stark and intentional. They made sure their success was visible, hosting elaborate parties that the entire neighborhood could see, driving past my apartment building in their expensive cars, shopping at the upscale stores where they knew I could no longer afford to shop. It was psychological warfare disguised as coincidence. Margaret's charity work was particularly gling. She'd become the poster child for successful organ donation, speaking at medical conferences and fundraising events. She talked about the anonymous angel who'd saved her life, never mentioning that the angel was now destitute and sick as a direct result of helping her. The irony was so thick it was suffocating. She was raising money for organ donation, while the woman who donated to her couldn't afford her own medical care. But cracks were beginning to show in their perfect facade. David's business success seemed too sudden, too connected to his personal relationship with Amanda. Competitors were asking questions about how he'd landed contracts that should have gone to more established firms. There were whispers about nepotism, about deals made over dinner tables rather than through proper bidding processes. Margaret's charity work was raising eyebrows, too. She'd become addicted to the attention, the admiration, the sense of importance that came with being a medical miracle. Other stories were becoming increasingly elaborate, her speeches more dramatic, her claims about her near-death experience growing more fantastical with each telling. People who knew about organ donation were starting to question some of her statements about the process. I watched all of this unfold from my position at the bottom, too weak and too broke to fight back directly. But I was learning things about patience, about observation, about the way that people who build their lives on lies eventually get trapped by their own fabrications. Margaret and David were living high on a foundation of deception, and foundations like that have a tendency to crumble when you least expect it. All I had to do was wait and watch, letting their own arrogance plant the seeds of their destruction. 8 months after my donation, David's golden run hit its first snag when a rival contractor filed a complaint with the state licensing board. The accusation was simple but damaging. David had been winning contracts through personal relationships rather than competitive bidding, potentially violating several state regulations about fair business practices. Amanda's father was named specifically in the complaint as someone who steered work to David's company without proper oversight. The investigation made local news, though David tried to downplay it as jealous competitors attacking his success. But I could see the stress in his social media posts, the way his confident smile looked forced in recent photos. Amanda's family was distancing themselves from the controversy, and several of David's newer clients were quietly reviewing their contracts. Success built on shaky foundations tends to wobble when examined too closely. Margaret's situation was developing its own problems. Her increasingly dramatic speeches about her transplant experience had caught the attention of actual medical professionals who worked in organ donation. A surgeon at the transplant center where we'd had the procedure reached out to correct some misinformation in her public presentations. Her claims about being minutes from death when she received the kidney didn't match her medical records. More concerning was Margaret's growing dependency on the attention and validation her story brought her. She'd started embellishing details about her relationship with her anonymous donor, creating an elaborate fiction about receiving letters and gifts from this mysterious benefactor. When pressed for details by curious audiences, she'd become vague and emotional, claiming the relationship was too personal to share. I'd been quietly building my own small support network during this time. Dr. Patricia Williams, the surgeon who'd handled my post-operative care, had become an unexpected ally. She was appalled by how I'd been treated and had been documenting my ongoing health issues as evidence of the medical establishment's failure to protect donors. Through her, I'd connected with a social worker who specialized in post-surgical trauma and a lawyer who worked pro bono for medical victims. My health had stabilized somewhat, though I'd never be the same. The single kidney was functioning adequately, but I required regular monitoring and would need careful medical management for life. What surprised everyone was how much stronger I'd become mentally during my darkest period. The isolation and poverty had burned away everything superficial, leaving something harder and more focused than I'd ever been before. The lawyer, Janet Morrison, had been quietly reviewing my case for weeks. She'd identified several potential legal issues with how thedonation had been handled, particularly the lack of proper counseling about the social and financial risks I'd face. More interesting was her investigation into David and Margaret's behavior immediately after the surgery. What they did might not be illegal, she told me, but it paints a picture of fraud regarding their intentions when they solicited the donation. Margaret's charity work was beginning to generate the wrong kind of attention. A journalist writing about organ donation had noticed inconsistencies between Margaret's public statements and the actual donation process. When she'd contacted the transplant center for verification, she'd been told that many of Margaret's claims were medically impossible. The story was starting to take shape as an exposé of how donation survivors sometimes exploit their experiences for personal gain. As autumn approached, I could feel the balance beginning to shift. David and Margaret were still living their golden lives, but the foundation was showing stress fractures. They'd gotten careless, too comfortable in their success, too confident that their lies would never be examined closely. But the truth has weight, and lies can only support so much weight before they collapse. I was finally strong enough to start applying some pressure of my own. The first domino fell when Amanda's family cut David loose completely. The state investigation had revealed that Amanda's father had indeed steered contracts to David's company inappropriately, and the family needed to distance themselves from the scandal to protect their own business interests. Amanda, faced with choosing between David and her inheritance, made the practical choice. I learned about their breakup when David's social media went silent and the expensive house went up for sale. Margaret's downfall was more dramatic. The journalist's investigation had uncovered hospital records showing that Margaret's condition, while serious, had never been as dire as she claimed in her speeches. More damaging was the discovery that she'd been accepting donations from families inspired by her story. Donations that were supposed to go toward organ donation awareness, but had instead funded her new lifestyle. I was having coffee at a small cafe when I saw Margaret for the first time in nearly a year. She looked older, stressed, her carefully maintained appearance showing cracks. She was alone, frantically making phone calls that seemed to be going to voicemail. When her eyes met across the cafe, she froze like a deer in headlights. For a moment, neither of us moved. Then something extraordinary happened. Instead of the rage or fear I'd expected to feel, I felt nothing but calm curiosity. This woman had destroyed my life, stolen my health, ruined my reputation, and left me to die alone. But looking at her now, desperate and cornered, I felt only a cool sort of satisfaction. "Hello, Margaret," I said quietly, walking over to her table. She tried to compose herself, to summon the imperious attitude she'd used to dismiss me before. "Olivia, we need to talk," she said, glancing around nervously. "There have been some misunderstandings about the donation situation. People are saying things that aren't true." Her voice had lost its confident edge, becoming pleading and uncertain. I sat down across from her without being invited, studying her face with the same detached interest I might show a specimen under a microscope. "What kind of misunderstandings?" I asked. She began stumbling through an explanation about journalists taking her words out of context, about jealous people trying to destroy her charity work, about how she'd always been grateful for my contribution to her recovery. "You called it a contribution," I said, interrupting her rambling justification. "Interesting choice of words." Her face flushed and she started to explain again, but I held up a hand. "Margaret, you destroyed my life because it was convenient for you. You turned my sacrifice into your personal profit center. You left me to die while you collected money and admiration for being the victim I helped create." She opened her mouth to argue, to justify, to make excuses, but something in my expression stopped her. I stood up slowly, my movements deliberate and controlled. "The truth is coming out, Margaret, all of it. And unlike you, I don't need to lie or perform or beg for sympathy." I paused at her table, looking down at this woman who'd once held such power over my life. Enjoy what time you have left before everyone sees who you really are. As I walked away, I could hear her making more phone calls, her voice rising in panic. She was trying to control a narrative that was slipping away from her, calling in favors from people who were no longer answering. For the first time since the divorce papers landed on my hospital bed, I felt like myself again, strong, clear, and completely unafraid of Margaret's power to hurt me. That power had been an illusion, and illusions eventually fade. The newspaper article came out on a Thursday morning, and by Friday afternoon, Margaret's carefully constructed world was in ruins. Local transplant survivor accused of charity fraud. Read the headline with a detailed investigation that exposed every lie, every exaggeration, every dollar she'd collected under false pretenses. The reporter had spoken to medical professionals, reviewed financial records, and interviewed people who donated money expecting it to support organ donation awareness. Margaret's response was predictably desperate. She held a press conference denying all allegations, claiming she was being persecuted by jealous people who couldn't stand to see a transplant survivor succeed. But her performance was erratic and defensive, raising more questions than it answered. When a reporter asked about the identity of her kidney donor, she claimed doctor-patient confidentiality prevented her from discussing details, not realizing this made her sound even more suspicious. David's situation deteriorated just as quickly. The state licensing board ruled that his business practices violated several regulations, suspending his contractor's license pending a full investigation. His clients abandoned him en masse, demanding refunds for work that might not meet legal standards. The expensive house went into foreclosure and his assets were frozen while investigators determined how much of his recent income was legitimate. I watched their collapse from my small apartment, feeling neither joy nor sadness, just a sense of cosmic balance being restored. Dr. Williams called to tell me that the hospital had launched its own investigation into how donor after-hour had been handled in my case. Your situation has highlighted some serious gaps in our system. She said, "We're implementing new protocols to protect future donors from what happened to you." The legal situation was moving forward, too. Janet Morrison had filed a civil suit against David and Margaret for fraud and intentional infliction of emotional distress. "We're not just seeking monetary damages," she explained. "We're establishing precedent that donors can't be exploited and abandoned by the people they help." The local media was interested in the case as a follow-up to the charity fraud story. Margaret tried to contact me multiple times, leaving increasingly frantic voicemails that evolved from defensive to pleading to outright begging. "Olivia, please, you have to help me." One message said, "Tell them what really happened. Tell them I was grateful. Tell them I never meant for any of this to happen." I deleted each message without responding, feeling no obligation to save the woman who'd watched me drown without throwing a rope. David's attempts at reconciliation were even more pathetic. He showed up at my apartment complex, looking haggarded and desperate, claiming he'd made mistakes and wanted to make things right. When I refused to see him, he started leaving letters under my door. Rambling apologies mixed with attempts to blame Margaret for everything. She manipulated me too. One letter claimed, "I was as much a victim as you were." The final blow came when Amanda's family filed their own lawsuit against David, claiming he'd defrauded them by misrepresenting his business qualifications. They wanted back every penny they'd invested in his company, plus damages for the reputation harm his scandal had caused their family. David was facing financial ruin from multiple directions with no resources left to fight any of it. The golden boy who traded me in for a better model was learning that some trades come with hidden costs. A year after the newspaper expose, Margaret was facing criminal charges for charity fraud, and David had filed for bankruptcy. The state had seized Margaret's assets to compensate people who donated money based on her false claims, leaving her living in a one-bedroom apartment across town, surviving on disability payments. David had moved back in with his elderly parents, his contractor's license permanently revoked, working part-time at a hardware store. The civil suit had resulted in a substantial settlement that covered my medical expenses and provided enough money for me to finally get proper health care. More importantly, it established legal precedent, protecting organ donors from exploitation by recipients. Dr. Williams had invited me to speak at medical conferences about donor rights, turning my experience into advocacy that might prevent others from suffering similar abandonment. I'd used part of the settlement money to go back to school, earning a certification in patient advocacy with a focus on transplant issues. The work was deeply satisfying, helping other donors navigate the complex medical and legal landscape I'd learned to understand through necessity. My health had improved significantly with proper care, and while I'd never be completely normal again, I was stronger than I'd been in years. Margaret's social media presence had vanished entirely. The charity organizations had expelled her. The speaking engagements had dried up, and the community that had once celebrated her now treated her like a pariah. I occasionally saw her at the grocery store or pharmacy looking older and more defeated each time. She'd lost weight, her hair had gone gray, and she moved through the world with the furtive manner of someone trying to avoid recognition. David had tried several times to restart his business under different names, but his reputation preceded him everywhere in our small community. Amanda had married someone from her own social circle and moved to another state, erasing David from her life as completely as if he'd never existed. His parents, embarrassed by their son's behavior, had cut him off from family social events, leaving him as isolated as he'd once left me. The most satisfying justice was the simplest. They were living the life they'd condemned me to. Financial stress, social isolation, medical concerns, and the constant weight of a reputation they couldn't escape. They'd learned what it felt like to be discarded by people who'd once claimed to care about them, to be judged and found wanting by a community that no longer had use for them. I'd built a new life that was smaller than my old one, but infinitely more honest. My apartment was tiny but comfortable. My work was meaningful, if not highly paid, and my relationships were with people who valued integrity over convenience. I'd learned to find satisfaction in simple things: good health reports, peaceful evenings, the respect of colleagues who knew my story and admired my resilience. The strangest part was that I'd stopped thinking about revenge entirely. What I'd wanted was justice, recognition that what they'd done was wrong, and consequences that matched their cruelty. The universe had provided all of that without requiring any malicious action from me. I'd simply had to survive long enough for their own choices to catch up with them, for their lies to crumble under scrutiny, for their selfishness to isolate them from everyone who might have helped them. 3 years after that terrible morning in the hospital, I stood before a packed auditorium at the National Donor Rights Conference, preparing to deliver the keynote address. The audience included transplant surgeons, patient advocates, legal experts, and donor families from across the country. My story had become a catalyst for systemic change in how the medical community protects and supports living donors. The legislation I'd helped draft, known informally as the Donor Protection Act, had passed in 6 states and was under consideration in 12 more. It required comprehensive counseling about social and financial risks before donation, mandated ongoing support for donors, and created legal protections against exploitation by recipients. Medical schools were now teaching courses on donor rights. Using my case as a primary example, my work as a patient advocate had expanded beyond individual cases to policy development and training programs. I consulted with hospitals on donor protection protocols, testified before legislative committees, and trained social workers to recognize signs of donor exploitation. The settlement money had allowed me to take lower-paying but more meaningful work, turning my trauma into purpose that helped others avoid similar suffering. David and Margaret had become cautionary tales in the transplant community, their names synonymous with the worst possible outcomes of unethical behavior toward donors. Margaret was working part-time at a call center, her charity fraud conviction making her unemployable in any role involving trust or public interaction. David had moved to another state, trying to rebuild his life away from the reputation that followed him everywhere locally. I developed an unexpected friendship with Dr. Williams, who'd become a fierce advocate for donor rights within the medical community. "You changed how we think about our responsibilities," she told me over coffee one afternoon. Before your case, we focused entirely on recipient outcomes. Now we understand that our duty extends to protecting the people who make transplants possible. The systemic changes felt more important than any personal vindication. My health had stabilized completely thanks to the proper medical care I could finally afford. Regular monitoring showed my remaining kidney functioning well, my blood pressure was controlled, and the chronic fatigue had largely resolved. I'd even started dating again. Cautiously but hopefully, having learned to distinguish between people who valued me and those who saw me as useful. The difference was clearer now, sharpened by experience. The most profound change was in how I saw myself. I was no longer the woman who'd been discarded in a hospital bed, desperate and broken. I'd become someone who'd transformed suffering into strength, injustice into advocacy, personal trauma into systemic change. The kidney I'd given Margaret had indeed saved a life, just not in the way anyone had expected. It had saved mine by forcing me to discover reserves of resilience I'd never known I possessed. Margaret and David had taught me that some people view kindness as weakness to be exploited, rather than strength to be honored. But they'd also taught me that people who build their lives on cruelty eventually find themselves living in the ruins of their own choices. I hadn't needed to destroy them. I just needed to survive long enough for them to destroy themselves, while using my survival to ensure others wouldn't face the same abandonment. Standing at that podium, looking out at hundreds of faces, ready to hear how the medical community could better protect its most vulnerable helpers, I felt complete in a way I'd never experienced before. This wasn't the life I'd planned, but it was the life I'd earned through fire and faith and refusing to let cruelty define my future. Now, I want to hear from you. What would you have done in Olivia's place? Comment here with your opinion. Like and subscribe as it's a free way to support my work. And if you want to hear another emotional story, click on the video that's appearing to your